Good evening, and we're once again looking at Christian worldview, and tonight particularly we're looking at government. And in this day and age, with everything that's going on, it's a very interesting topic. How do we figure out what to follow in terms of government today, in terms of from a Christian perspective? There's so many things that are happening that seem counter to what we think is the Christian worldview. How do we look at the United States, for example? How do we look at other countries in the world and how they are affected in their governments? So there's a number of things to look at, I believe, and I think RC is going to give us some good direction on this. So without further ado, we will start the video, and I am going to exit from here, my camera and the video panel.
In this session, we're going to consider now the Christian as he relates to the governments of this world. And as you know, that also is a very controversial area of concern for the Christian, as some feel that the Christian belonging to another world, to the kingdom of God and to the kingdom of heaven, should have nothing whatsoever to do with the powers and principalities of this world. But I want to take the time today to look at chapter 13 of Paul's epistle to the Romans, which in its initial section at least gives us one of the most important pieces of instruction that we get in the New Testament with respect to our understanding of government. Chapter 13 begins with an exhortation and indeed an imperative from the apostle, in which he writes, "Let every person be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God." Let me just pause there for a second. There is no authority except from God. That is the ground basis and the foundation of all authority in the universe resides in the character of God. It does not reside in the will of man or in the will of human institutions, but ultimately authority derives from the author of all things, namely God himself. And we must remember too at this point the statement that Jesus makes in the New Testament in terms of his relationship to the Father, by which Jesus said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given unto me." Again, as part of the parenthesis, let me make this statement, which may sound extravagant, but I ask you to chew on it and think about it, and that is this, that Christianity, as a life and worldview, as a living faith, is not merely a religion isolated from other dimensions of human life, and that's why we're dealing with these different concerns here, but that Christianity, in its essential message, is pervasively political. It is pervasively political. As I say, that may shock your ears off, but what I have in mind here is that the theme of the New Testament that we hear again and again and again is the announcement of the coming kingdom of God, the rule of God, the reign of God over this world. And in that sense, insofar as the New Testament is concerned with focusing on the kingship of Jesus Christ, the Bible is making a political statement. It is making a statement about authority and the regulation of life in this world. Not political in the human institutional sense. That's not what I mean, though it touches human political matters, as we see here in chapter 13. There is no authority except from God, and those which exist, that is, those authorities which exist, are established by God. Therefore, he who resists authority has opposed the ordination or the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. So the text here is concerned about civil obedience. The Christian's responsibility to be subject to earthly spheres of authority. Seeing in those spheres of authority an authority that derives from God himself. For again, Paul says, there is no government, there is no authority except that which is established, instituted, and ordained of God. That is one of the most difficult messages from the New Testament to hear, because it's particularly problematic that Paul makes these statements while he's addressing what particular group of people? Those who live where? In Jerusalem? You know, is he saying we all have to be subjected to the religious authorities of the Sanhedrin? Or to the theocratic authority of the state of Israel? He's writing to the Romans. He's talking to people who are living under a secular government, a corrupt government, and indeed a government that is opposed to the very principles of Christianity. And in a very short period of time after Paul wrote this letter, a government that set forth probably the most vicious program of persecution against the Christian church that has ever been unleashed in the history of the world. A government, incidentally, that executed the man who wrote these words, the Apostle Paul. He's saying, be subject to that government. And again, why? Not out of a view of political expediency, but out of a viewpoint of bringing honor and glory to God who stands behind that government. Now, how in the world could God be related to a godless government? How can God ordain an ungodly political institution? That's what has been so troublesome to people who wrestle with the responsibility that the church has with respect to matters of civil obedience. Because this passage, incidentally, is not an isolated one in the New Testament. Again and again, we are told to honor the king, to subject ourselves to the magistrates. And St. Peter tells us that we are to submit ourselves to the civil magistrates that Christ might be honored. That Christ might be honored. Well, there are two things that we need to understand here, and that is, in the first place, the concept biblically of all earthly government is, in a sense, hierarchical. That all human authority, from the dog catcher up to the governor and to the senator and to the prince or to the king or to the president, whatever, all comes under the authority of God and of His Christ. Now, does that mean that every one of these human authorities exercises godly rule? Of course not. We know that. And it is very possible for there to be, as Paul speaks of elsewhere, spiritual wickedness in high places, in the governments. Oscar Kuhlmann, the Swiss theologian, even suggested that there's a sense in which governments in this world can become utterly demonic and stand in fierce opposition to the reign of Jesus Christ. Yet, the operative principle in the New Testament for the Christian is obeying the civil magistrate. Not because we are trying to exalt the human authorities, but we recognize that behind those authorities stands the authority of Christ and the authority of God. Okay? Again, Peter's statement, obey the civil magistrates that Christ may be glorified. How does my obedience of the political institutions and the civil magistrates bring honor to Jesus? There's a concept that I think it's important for us to understand, and that is that in the New Testament, in fact in the Old Testament as well, that the idea of sin is not merely viewed in individualistic, bite-size pieces of particular sins or even of particular sinful people. But there is a concept of corporate solidarity where there are the sins of the nations. There is such a thing biblically as institutional sin. And so in our broad understanding of sin, biblically, we see that sin is not merely particular, atomistic, and individual, but that there is what we call a complex of evil in the world. A complex of evil. And who stands behind the complex of evil? Theologically, Satan, the prince of this world, who is identified biblically with the anti-Christ. The one who exalts himself above Christ and who moves and works contrary to, over against the work of the Christ. Hence the title anti. The word Greek there is anti. It just comes right over into English, and it can mean in place of or against, both of which are activities that we associate with the figure of the Antichrist biblically. He is one who not only stands against Christ, but who seeks to supplant Christ, who seeks to take the place of Christ. And the basic activity of the Antichrist, or of the cosmic struggle with Satan, is the induction to a spirit of disobedience, or what the Bible calls lawlessness. In fact, the Antichrist, in terms of his historical manifestation, is described by Paul in the Thessalonican correspondence as the man of what? The man of lawlessness. In the Sermon on the Mount, which we've reviewed in other settings, Jesus gives the warning at the end of the sermon, many will come to me at the last day and say, Lord, Lord, did we not do this in your name, and did we not do that in your name, and so on. And he said, I will say to them, depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. You who are the sons of disobedience. So there's a certain sense, what I'm trying to do to abstract here for a second, is that man's greatest problem, in other words, the thing that causes the whole creation in which we live to groan, is a spirit of lawlessness that is of the essence of sin. There would be no death in this world, there'd be no murder, there'd be no wars, there'd be no problems of the violation of human personality if, in fact, every person was lawful and obedient with respect to authority, namely the authority of God. So what we're seeing here is kind of a carryover, a spilling over of the spirit of man, by which we begin with our refusal to obey God, and that spills over into our basic, natural, corrupt propensity to resist all other authority. So there's a sense biblically in which the Christian is called to bend over backwards to respect authority wherever he sees it, and to be bearing witness to a spirit of obedience rather than lawlessness. This came out very early in the Christian church with the outbreak of persecutions. We think, for example, of the work of the first great apologist of the early church, Justin Martyr, aptly named because he gave his life for the faith. How many of you have ever heard of Justin Martyr? How many never have heard of Justin Martyr? All right, he wrote the first, what was called apologia, or reply, apologetic. Justin addressed his essay to the then Roman Emperor Antoninus Pius, and he was answering the charges that were brought against the Christians. Even Nero couldn't just send people to the lions or use Christians for human torches without some kind of legal justification. Charges were brought against the Christians, and those charges included that they were atheists. Why? Because they did not believe in the gods of the Roman pantheon. No bowing to Jupiter and so on. They were accused of being cannibals. Why do you suppose that was? Because they gathered together to eat somebody's body and drink his blood. And so they had that problem. And then the third and biggest justification for the persecutions of the Romans was that the Christians were called to be seditious, insurrectionists, because they refused to recite publicly the loyalty oath of the empire, which in effect deified the emperor. And they were required to say simply, Kaiser Kyrios, Caesar is Lord. And they refused. They said, we say, Jesus ho Kyrios, Jesus is Lord. And in response, therefore, because their refusal to submit to the absolute allegiance to the emperor that the emperor demanded, they were accused of being civilly disobedient and therefore thrown to the lions. Now, what Justin Martyr did when he wrote to the emperor was he tried to explain to the emperor of the Roman Empire what the Christian and biblical position was. He said, look at us. We are model citizens. Our religion teaches us to pray for the emperor, to honor the emperor, to be submissive. We're called to pay our taxes. We are called to honor you. We drive our chariots within the speed limit. But there is a limit to that. We cannot worship you. But when it comes to the daily practical matters of civil obedience, we are the model citizens of your empire. And the early church understood that accent in the New Testament. They were not given to anarchist activities or revolutionary activities, and Jesus had earlier rebuked the zealots that were seeking to overthrow the wicked governments by the power of the sword. Now that has led some to the conviction and to the conclusion that therefore Christians must never disobey the civil authorities. But can we come to that conclusion biblically? Of course not. Because the Bible itself testifies when the authorities forbade Peter and John from preaching. You remember in the book of Acts? They said we must obey God rather than men. So if the civil authority commands you, if this lower level of authority commands you to do something that God has forbidden, or forbids you from doing something God has commanded, not only may you disobey, but what? You must disobey. You must always obey God rather than men. But you're not called to disobey simply because you don't like the policies, or simply because they inconvenience you, or even may cause you to suffer. Because God has not commanded you to live a life free of suffering. But if the civil magistrate says you must do something like deny Christ, you have to disobey the civil magistrate. But again, do you see that the basic emphasis is the posture of bending over backwards to be submissive in that spirit of humility when and wherever possible without compromising your commitment to God. Now again, another reason for this is not only that God stands behind it, but that God ordains government in the first place. God ordains government in the first place. Where does government begin? Earthly government or creaturely government? Where's the first illustration of it that we find in the Bible? Notice that there's an authority structure built into creation, but in that authority structure built into creation, there aren't any governments. Why not? What else was absent in the Garden of Eden?
Evil.
Evil. Sin. All right? It's only after the fall of man that human government is established. And before that, a creature, I was using the word creaturely rather than human, because as soon as Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden and they are forced to live east of Eden, don't you think they would have a certain degree of homesickness? Don't you think that they would have liked to have returned? What would have happened if they wanted to return? Could they have gotten in? Why?
Because there was the angel.
Because there was an angel posted at the gateway to the Garden of Eden, and what did the angel have? A flaming sword. And there we see, why did he have a flaming sword? What was the purpose of the sword? To keep them out, that is, to use the sword as an instrument of restraint, or as an instrument of power, or if you will, an instrument of force. Now, let me give you the simplest definition of government that we can come up with. Government, whether it is socialistic, communistic, whether it's oligarchy, plutarchy, you know, whatever it is, democracy, monarchy, any kind of government that exists is force. Government is force. And it exists under God as a force to restrain evil. For what purpose? Bottom line, for the survival of the race. For the protection, the sustaining, and the maintenance of human life and property. Okay? And God gives it authority and the power to back up that authority. That's why governments not only have law, but they also have law enforcement agencies. I talked to a United States Senator a few years ago, and he made this statement to me over lunch. He said, "I don't believe that any government ever has the right to coerce its citizens to do anything." And I said, "That's a noble sentiment, Senator. But what I've just heard you say is that no government ever has the right to govern. If the governments don't have the right of coercion, what can they do but suggest? You have law without law enforcement." And I reminded him that the power of the sword that is established in the Old Testament and reiterated here in chapter 13, where if I can read for you quickly, verse 3, "For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it," that is the government, "is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid. For it does not bear the sword for nothing. It is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath upon one who practices evil." So what Paul is saying is that that power of the force, the power of the sword, God gives the civil magistrate. He does not give it to the church. Jesus takes the swords away from Peter and his friends in the Garden of Gethsemane. The church does not have the power of political coercion. But the state does. And its function and design and purpose of the sword is to protect the innocent and to restrain the evildoer. Now, does it ever happen that the government uses the sword to exploit and oppress the innocent and protect the wicked? Yes. And those governments are, of course, corrupt and demonic and should hear the prophetic criticism of the people of God. The idea that government, therefore, is evil casts a shadow upon the God who has established it and ordained it and instituted it in the first place. I go back to St. Augustine for a very short little statement that I think captures the essence of what our attitude should be. Augustine said this: governments are a necessary evil. Not because every government is necessarily evil, but by the fact that government itself is made necessary by the fact of evil. And that even though governments may be oppressive and exploitive and corrupt, the worst government is still better than what? No government. Because the no government syndrome, which guarantees absolute freedom, also gives absolute freedom to the unrighteous people who can wield their power and corruption with no protection available to the innocent and the weak. Pure anarchy is the law of the jungle, which God says is, not to be desired. So that God himself stands behind world governments, using them for his ends and for his glory, but principally as an instrument of the restraining power of evil. No matter how evil that government is, things can conceivably be worse. If God removed all human restraints, life would be intolerable upon us. And therefore he has instituted government and given that government the sword to which we are called to give our righteous submission whenever possible. One final point. What if the Christian is called to serve in government? And that includes in the army or in the state house or whatever. If the government is doing the task that God has called it to do, I ask the question, why should not a Christian be expected to participate? That is to say, we cannot buy the idea that the church relates to God and that the state doesn't. Crucial point. Historically in this country, we hold the idea of separation of church and state, but both church and state are under God. Church has its function, state has its function to perform. And so when the state is performing the function to which God has called it, we as people who are subjects of God should not be resisting it, but should be participating in it. But what has happened in our day is that the concept of separation of church and state has come to mean for many people the separation of state and God, as if the state ruled autonomously on the basis of its own intrinsic authority. Christians can't buy that. We see the state as answerable to God, ordained by God, and is certainly a legitimate vehicle for the people of God to serve God. So that if in our vocations we can serve the world by serving our fellow man in government, we are not acting against Christ at that level, but our involvement in government is an arena in which the Christian is called to bear witness to the righteousness and the style of government that Christ himself exhibits. That doesn't mean that we take the church into the state, but we take Christians, because you see, even though God is over church and state, the Christian lives in both church and state. And he has one set of responsibilities to the church and another set of the responsibility to the state, one of which is subjection to the powers that be.
Well, that brings us to some of the questions. I guess in Romans 13, we find that the Christian's relationship to good government is to obey. It's to do those things that the government asks for and requires, render unto Caesar. And if they are doing good things, then it's it'll be a good thing. However, there is the situation that we find that is bad government, and we want to be sure that we don't have that. And the question is, how do we determine what is good and what is an evil government? Well, obviously, we go to the Word, we go to the Scriptures to determine if what the government is asking us to do is evil or good. As Paul pointed out in Rome, in the times of the apostles and the new disciples that were meeting together and fellowshipping together, they were being persecuted, and because they would not praise the Roman gods and even the emperor. So they were then required. They were required to do that. When they did not do that, many of them were martyred for that very reason. But that brings up a point, and I think we need to think about this. When is our government doing things that we need to stop, that we need to say no? We're trying to do that. We try to do that with the abortion issue. We seek to have legislation that will end abortion. We protest at clinics. We seek to have women who are pregnant and aren't sure that they want to have a baby to come to a crisis pregnancy center. So we're doing things in that regard. Do we ever make the mistake of setting the government up as an idol? I wrestle with this because I almost feel that people looked to Trump as an idol, and that was a very difficult thing. So there's some things to think about. I wish people were in here and we could have some discussion on this, but we could also, if anybody wants to, we could come back together at some point and continue this discussion. What is God's purpose for the institution of government? Well, God's purpose is for him to be glorified. That's simply what it is. It's for God to be glorified and honored. So the government should be doing that. Now, we have a government now that has taken this idea of the separation of church and state, which there is a separation because the state has certain roles that they have and that they are commissioned by God to do. We find some of those things. They are to take care of the people. They are to give people the things that they need to be able to live comfortably. So the government has certain roles that they have. The church has certain roles. And a lot of times it's pretty clearly defined that what we call ecclesiastic, the church is functioning in a certain way, but sometimes those lines get crossed. I seem to think that with welfare, the lines have been crossed. Before welfare was on the table and part of what we do, the church took care of the people in need and established things, because many of the hospitals around the country were started either by Protestants or Roman Catholics. Many hospitals. Um, Institutions of higher education, many were started by churches. Many were started by people that wanted higher education, more in-depth study. And so those things have been a part of the country for years. The government has sort of moved in and actually required some things of schools in order for them to receive federal funding. So there's these crossovers. And I might say this about the funding for colleges. Grove City College would not go along with the government's insistence that they sign a non-discrimination clause document. Grove City was saying, we don't need to sign it. We don't discriminate. So there's no reason for us to, we've never been accused of that. So there's no reason for us to sign it. And the government told them, well, if you're not going to sign this, then you're not going to get federal money. And that includes federal grants for your students. Grove City said, that's fine, because they have endowments that they're able to use. And I don't know if it's true today, but at one time, Grove City was the least, one of the least expensive schools in the country. So, you know, those are the things we should be wrestling with. How is the institution of government glorifying to God? How do you avoid involving God in evil, since there are so many evil governments? How do you avoid involving God in evil, since there are so many evil governments? Well, first of all, we have to remember that God ordains governments. It is God who puts governments in power. He allows, just as he allows individuals to basically sin and do evil things, he allows governments the same thing. And when the evil becomes so pervasive, then many times something has to happen to either eradicate those governments or change them. We think of the evil of Stalin and Hitler and the governments that they headed, and the Chinese governments. And we think of those, and we know that they have not been successful. They're not successful to what their stated mission is, and that is one of their problems, is their stated mission and what they actually do are two different things. But God is not involved in evil. The evil comes from those individuals that are running things, so to speak. What guidelines would you establish for disobeying man and obeying God? Well, it looks like in some cases we're facing that. We had, during the pandemic, the government telling the church that they could not meet. And yet, when the court cases came, we were allowed to meet. But there were some churches that just basically said, hey, we're going to meet. We're going to meet anyway. And our own congregation at Shearer Presbyterian Church, we started meeting as soon as we were able to, and we did not listen to the government necessarily about having to wear masks and having to social distance. We allowed the people to determine that. And so in a small sense, we were saying, look, we're going to allow people to make their own decisions. And it worked. We had no COVID cases for 5 months and almost 6 months. And even with that, we've only really had 2 serious ones that I'm aware of. The basic thing is, if man calls for us to do things that are against what God has commanded us to do, has given us guidance on what to do, then we have to obey God and not man. What is the role of the church, and encourage government to recognize its responsibility before God? Well, we've mentioned the abortion issue. We need to be telling the government that abortion is wrong. We need to let them know that this is an abomination before God. It's not our position, but it's an abomination before God. So we have that's one thing. We need to be prophetic in how we deal with the government and how we share with them what direction they need to go in. Oftentimes, those that have a prophetic voice are put down, but that's our responsibility before God, to be prophetic in terms of what the world and what the government is asking us to do and actually doing. How can the church manifest the kingship of Christ over the world? Well, the church needs to stay the course. The church needs to keep close to the word, keep submitting itself to the word, and seek revival in the land, continue to meet and be obligated to the government, so that God is glorified. As we give our taxes, we glorify God because we're obeying what he has told us to do. But if the government's using that money for something that we do not agree with, then we need to make the government accountable, because Christ is the king. Ultimately, God is ruling over everything. As R.C. pointed out, from the dog catcher to the king and all in between, God is manifest over top of them. The blank were a religious group that sought to overthrow the government by the power of the sword. That would be the Zealots. The Zealots were looking for a political leader to come in and really take over the government. They wanted a leader who was going to be a political leader. And so many of them were looking to Christ to do that. And so the Zealots are the ones that were a religious group that wanted to overthrow the government. Government is made necessary because of evil. And that's why government puts in place certain things to suppress the evil that's in the world. That's why we have a police force. That's why we have military. That's why we have laws to restrain the evil. We don't have to look far to see evil in the world, and it's rampant. It's worse today than probably anything in many people's memories. So it's because of evil that there's a government that's needed. The basis for all authority in the universe resides in the character of God. That is true. Both the church and the state are instituted by and under the authority of God. Absolutely true. God, if he is God and he's sovereign and he's in control, obviously he's the authority over everything. He is the creator and the sustainer. And so he is the one that has the authority over all things. He could come back at any time and establish his kingdom across the world and reign in righteousness. Well, next week we're going to take a look at art, and then the following week we will take a look at literature. So we'll be coming to the end of this class in just a couple of weeks here. And I know I'm enjoying it, and I hope that if anybody looks at these after we finish these classes and they're up on YouTube, that you as well are getting something out of them. So for tonight, this will be our ending, and we will see you the next time.